So I want to open the Flood Control Board March 12th meeting, 6:32. Have open forum for any non-agenda items. So any item that you wish to discuss that's not already on the agenda to be discussed later where you would have an opportunity to speak, you can speak now. Seeing none, want to introduce Peter Brown, our new Public Works Director.
Thank you, Chair Bundy, members of the Flood Control Board. This is my first meeting that I get to attend, and I started in December, so it's been a few months now, and I'm getting my feet wet, so to speak, in terms of understanding the town's needs in the Public Works Department, and in particular the issues that you all deal with. Many of you may have seen the article that recently came out highlighting again the sea level rise and subsidence issues that we all have to deal with in the IJ. It talked a lot about the existing numbers and some of the refinements in terms of projections for subsidence, which looks to be in our area, this particular part of the bay, from here up to San Rafael, around about 2 millimeters per year on average. For those of you who don't convert metric very well, I like to call that about an inch every 12 years. So subsidence is an issue. I think maybe even more pertinent and certainly more pressing is the rate at which the sea level rise projections are going to continue to affect our communities. The thing that you all should be aware of is that the most recent projections that are mostly based on Arctic and Antarctic changes that have accelerated over the past decade, we should really be preparing for about 12 inches of sea level rise over the next decade. So that's a big number. It's the biggest number that we've seen anywhere on the west coast of a continent, and those are brand new. And a lot of the research has come here out of University of Washington and Berkeley. The other number that they said to look for is around 2 feet over the next 30 years. So looking a little further out, that's another number that we should be aware of. So, I know Kelly has been the liaison to this board. He'll continue to do that. And so I'm just here for, any particular issues. And when there's something that really relates to the department or that I have a particular issue, I'll certainly come before the board. But I think you're in good hands with Kelly Crow. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to have you on board. Approval of meeting minutes of February 12th. Any corrections, changes? Any corrections or changes to the meeting minutes from February 12th? No. Move to approve.
Move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Golden Hind Passage Tidal Barrier Project.
All right, I'll start the introduction and just the preamble to this topic. Tonight we have Rachel Kamen from Noble Consultants with us. She's been working on the Marina Village levee raise as well, and has been doing the conceptual design. So she offered to come and knows something about the area and similar projects, and what it really takes to address some of the concerns here. So really some of the impetus of having this project tonight before the flood board is, number one, we've discussed it at previous flood boards, and there is an imminent need to address certain portions of Mariners Cove. As we all recall from last winter, at Golden Hind at ebb tide, there was numerous instances where the road had to be closed because of bay water coming in from the side yards. So with our levees, there's an overall rehabilitation that needs to occur. We're talking about Lucky Drive, the levee that stretches in front of the village, Marina Village, and all the way around Mariner Cove. It's a connected system, but the way that we've been thinking about it is there's more near-term needs that I think we can accomplish, and also thinking about rolling it into a more master planned thought of how we're going to accomplish meeting the goals of sea level rise, also the FEMA requirements, base flood elevation plus freeboard, and really revamp them. I think some of the people who've lived in town for quite a while may remember the Lucky Drive project, and it went pretty far down the road. An EIR was developed, but ultimately a couple residents up on Lucky Drive, sued and blocked the project from getting constructed. So there will be, a large public outreach component to all of the projects that are done, and this one is no different. And what we've done tonight is we've prepared a slideshow to really kind of go over what components we envision are going to be in the project. As Board Member Garcia pointed out several months ago, that the public outreach component, what phases of the project is going to be really critical. And so it is somewhat of a delicate balance between going between the design consultants and back to the public. But we do have a strategy that we want to share with you. And the intent of tonight is really to start the discussion, get the ideas, let you know what we're thinking as far as moving forward, and solicit feedback from the board, and come back at a future meeting and really start to form the project that we can get a scope together for a consultant to develop a project team and really start on the improvements. So with that, this is Rachel. If you want to give a little background, and we can.
Sure. Shall I talk from here?
Yeah.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Kamen. I'm a hydraulic and coastal engineer and hydrologist. Yeah, thank you. With Noble Consultants, we have offices in Novato and also in Irvine. We've done work all over California, and a lot of work in the Bay Area and in Marin County. We have previously done work for the town of Corte Madera, most recently there's my little spreadsheet, in looking at these outer levees here, and that a lot of the information and engineering analysis that we brought together for that study really informs some of the measures that we're considering recommending for Mariners Cove. So I'm going to present some of that background today, and then some examples of comparable work. See, do I just scroll?
Yeah.
So project objectives is certainly something to be determined by the Public Works Department and the stakeholder community at large. And when we do these kinds of projects, even though they're very local projects, we end up involving a lot of stakeholders beyond the town. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But defining those objectives is very important to get to reaching a successful project. And in something like this, we're looking for coastal flood protection. We're also looking to promote or at least maintain the ecological values, because there are some very unique aspects of Mariners Village, one being that it's immediately adjacent to the Corte Madera Ecological Reserve. So that presents some very stringent restrictions on disturbance and impact in the area. So we have to be aware of those restrictions, as well as the engineering and structural restrictions. For coastal flood protection, again, one of the things that we will need to do is take a look at what our goals will be at different points in time, and those goals will need to accommodate sea level rise, extreme storm events, and then also longer-term goals. So we see the project as something to be built now to protect the community, but we also have to look into the future, past 2050, as a public works organization, to try and identify measures that are going to serve the community as a foundation of infrastructure for the future. So it's not just short-term fixes. We really have to look at the long-term in order to make it economically viable. In addition, we have stormwater management to deal with in this setting, right? Because we have the creek, which is passing through all the properties, and we have to figure out how and where, floodwaters meet tidewaters. Where does that management happen? At this point, this study is really only looking at that outer coastal barrier around Golden Hind. But when we look at the more regional objectives, we'll have to consider all of those pieces. And so we do that at Golden Hind, because we want it to be consistent, and because that's a more programmatic, that's a programmatic approach, right? We take all of the objectives we think we're going to need in this location, and we apply them to, you know, this particular area.
And just one thing on that, I think you bring up a great point about stormwater management, and with the last 3 bullet points there, as we saw, we see with the street flooding how it can shut down infrastructure, but what some of us don't see is the constant recirculation through our pumps, you know, the wearing of our pumps, you know, how they can create, you know, corrosion on our check valves, on our impellers. Constantly recycling bay water through our infrastructure is going to cause damage, and it's going to increase the maintenance costs significantly. Also, with our sewer system, it's going to dramatically increase the load on the sewer system and what our pump stations can handle in pumping into the Ross Valley Force Main. So there are larger infrastructure issues with the imminent flooding that we see with those low-lying areas, and obviously Golden Hind Ebb Tide is one of the lower parts of the subdivision. It's just recognized as the low point, and that's where we're seeing the near-term problem. And keeping the bay water out of our infrastructure as well out of people's homes is going to be a positive win in, you know, reducing our long-term maintenance costs.
I mean, we see in flood pump capacity as a limited quantity. So anywhere where tidal water is coming into the system, it's all going out in one place, right? So we really need to limit that, because if we allow tidal water into the system, then we're reducing the capacity for the whole time, basically. So, Kelly, do you want to speak to the planning framework?
So as far as the project planning goes, and the outline of the steps as we see moving forward, you know, once we, you know, start to develop the team, obviously the team is going to be, you know, a huge component, and the next slide will address who would be involved essentially in the team. But it's, you know, board member Garcia brought up a great point about, you know, getting out and at least letting the residents who are going to be affected by the potential construction or, you know, the project, letting them know, because as the next bullet point, you know, presents, you know, there's going to be geotechnical investigations, there's going to be field surveying, there's going to need to be access to the properties. And so, you know, thoughtfully going out to the residents, explaining what we're doing with the study, having something more than just saying, hey, we're going to be doing a survey on your property, letting them know what the project's going to entail, and doing a little bit more, I think will be a positive first step in at least presenting to them before anything's really even done, that, hey, this is the reason why we're back here, and this is what we're looking at, and here, by the way, are the next steps in the process, and you will be involved. So, you know, after the background information is gathered, you know, that's where we'd start to evaluate the environmental constraints. You know, there are a couple avenues that we can take, and we just don't know enough right now to make a decision either way. But you know, with environmental permitting, it could come down to needing a full-blown environmental impact report, or it could be something less depending on the route that we take. So we would want our consultant to give us options to have the least impactful solution, and also give us a couple other alternatives. If it were to come to a full-blown environmental impact report, it may make sense to roll it into a larger environmental impact report that phases the projects, but includes Lucky Drive and the other levees in the whole system. So we're doing it all at once and capturing it. So those are a couple options that we have right now, but once we get into that phase of the project, then those things will start to, you know, present themselves. Obviously, after we have concepts, after we have an idea of what the environmental process is going to be, and we have a more informative timeline, that's when we go back to, you know, additional public outreach. Most likely the Mariner Cove neighborhood, letting them know what the project is, you know, what the concepts are, what the impacts and what the benefits really are to the community. You know, from then, you know, develop the hard conceptual ideas of what the project's gonna look like, what the design's gonna be, the route that it's gonna take, the impacts, any sort of easements that would be required. That's where we'd really wanna form the project. Another thing is with the projected costs, I mean, it could be very well in the millions of dollars. You know, along this whole process, we'd be researching and trying to procure other funding sources to help out with the project cost. Obviously, you know, we'd want to obtain the environmental clearance before we even, you know, push further in the project. And finally, we do most likely a town council meeting or some sort of final public outreach to really know, before we go into final design, here are the steps that we've taken, here's the outreach, here's what we've done, here are the steps that we've taken, here are the funding sources. We're ready to go into final design, but here's the project, and any final comments before we actually get into final design, because once you start, you know, on final design, that's where a lot of the cost starts rolling through. So you really want to have a good idea and all the feedback that you possibly can have before you go into final design and actually start designing the project. So as far as the project team elements go, obviously, you know, a civil engineer is going to be critical to, you know, establishing the line and grade of the improvements, also being really the point person for all the other disciplines involved, and would take on more of the role of the overall, you know, project facilitator. You know, surveyors are going to be key to this. Getting field survey is going to be absolutely critical in getting really accurate survey back there. I don't think flying aerial, getting aerial topography is going to do it. It has too much of a allowable air to it, and field survey is really where you want to go. We do have a slide later that shows a comparison of some of the field surveys that have been done in recent years. You know, environmental consultants are going to be a huge part of this. It's really going to be a function of having someone guide us through the process of which regulatory agencies are going to have jurisdiction, what are all their requirements going to be, and most likely what it's going to entail is, you know, not one of them is going to sign off until the other signs off, so it's going to be somewhat of a, you know, an exercise in trying to get all of their clearances in order. But environmental is going to be a huge component of this. Geotechnical engineer is also going to be a huge component. As many of you know, the Mariner Cove neighborhood is really unique because of the depths of bay mud out there and the forecasted settlement out in the neighborhood. It's, you know, currently where there's 50 feet or more of bay mud underneath, it's projected to continue to settle past, you know, the 100-year timeline. So it's really, you know, it's material that will continue to consolidate over time. And we do have information that shows that, in fact, it has been settling. And so that component of it, and knowing what we're going to have to design to in and above the design elevations that come from any sort of sea level rise projections or FEMA-based flood elevations, we'll have to consider what the ultimate settlement's going to do to the improvement, knowing that it could settle more. Settlement's just it's the double-headed monster of sea level rise, because even if there was no increase in sea level, well, you start losing elevation on the ground, well, you essentially have de facto sea level rise. So that's going to be an important facet to understand here. Town staff, you know, public works director, senior engineer, the planning staff, you know, we're all engaged too. We're all going to be a part of this in working with the flood board and the community at large, and also internally to look at funding mechanisms. to provide, some guidance where we can and support information. So town staff's going to be a huge component. Also, the community stakeholders. There's a lot of other, besides the residents, who are, undoubtedly the important stakeholder out there who are going to be directly affected by, the improvements or the lack of improvements out there. There are other stakeholders. As we know, Audubon Society owns the Triangle Marsh, which is directly adjacent to it. And so we'd want to make sure that, others in the community that have a voice in this, or have an opportunity to comment on the project and solicit some feedback.
May I ask questions now, or will it be better at the end of the presentation?
It would be better at the end, but if it's just a clarification, or
Well, it will be about this slide.
yeah, go ahead.
So the first 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 bullet points, that's intended to be consultant staff. So the project engineer would be also consultant staff.
So the first 5 bullet points.
The
So
first 5.
everything up to a geotechnical engineer.
Everything up to town staff.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Including the engineering, that's consultant.
Yeah, that would be consultant work.
Because it seems that the planning and the design phase would be taken by the same consultant. I think that's a matter of having proper quality Busted. He got me from the back room. As a matter of both ensuring that there are no conflict of interest, and that there's a kind of peer review of the work done. I think it's worthwhile to account for third-party review of the work. It's just there's no particular concern that there's going to be such a conflict of interest, but it's relatively common that if those two phases are going to be developed by the same individuals, we want to make sure that the planning studies are not somewhat biased to solutions that are particular, that have the particular strength of those design consultants. I also think that that a cost estimator would probably be very, very important to have. I don't know if it's embedded into the civil engineer role or not.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know if a structural engineer would be a standalone individual, or again, if it's with the geotechnical.
Structural is typically within civil.
That's all. And then usually for this, when you have large projects, it's worthwhile to have a roadmap of all the studies that are going to happen. So for instance, for the planning phase, I usually, the textbook examples that I'm aware of usually have a needs assessment report that describes, well, what would you like to have? What is the goal of the project? What is it that you have, so the want and what you have, and then the difference is the need. So you establish the need of the project. The second report could be, or should be, an alternative analysis report that goes through the different means to satisfy the need that you have identified. And finally, you get the conceptual engineering report, which is you take the optimal alternative and develop it conceptually, including design criteria, so the next phase can start. Those don't need to be necessarily independent reports. They can be combined in any fashion that is considered. But I think it's worthwhile to have those intermediate check-ins and cost evaluations throughout. So the development of the project, it gets, peer review and disclosed.
And so in the conceptual phase on the previous slide, that's to clarify that would be included in the conceptual phase with any sort of concepts. The cost is going to be a huge component in understanding what the cost is going to be. So that would all be included in the concept phase.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of framework: for about 3 years, I developed a Nevada watershed study for the County Flood Control Board. And we started with a site assessment and synthesizing all of the data, storm drains, topography, infrastructure. And then we had a report and presented that information. Oh, sorry.
I just want to, Chair Bundy, this is on you. Everything is being recorded and televised, and so it is incumbent upon the chair to ensure that everyone's microphone is on, that they're speaking very close to the microphone. That includes any staff member, any consultant, and any member of your board. So I'm going to look to you to ensure that we don't have to have these interruptions anymore.
Understood.
Thank you. So I think you're 100% correct that we need to have a clear framework for the process and understand when stakeholders or technical advisory committee is involved. And in the past and in general, my goal in these kinds of infrastructure improvement projects, because they have so many different objectives, is to try and build consensus around, with all of the stakeholders in the project. So we have the residents whose property this is going to function on. We have Public Works who has to manage and find a way to pay for the infrastructure, the resource agencies. So we try and put all these people together in the same room. We did the same sort of thing when we did the Hamilton wetland restoration. And that was a very large stakeholder group. And there are funds sometimes that are available to support that community outreach for local area governments. So I would encourage that we set up that process. And then typically the development of concepts gets to about 30% design, and we have cost estimates there. And as we develop concepts, I can bring or we can share some of those with you. We build these, or you can build these large matrices essentially of, what are your goals? What are the alternatives to reach those? What are each of the engineering elements associated with, and what are the costs? And then the stakeholder group prioritizes these elements, and that's essentially how we piece together the design of a regional project. And a local project is a little more straightforward, but there's a lot of pros and cons, I think, that we'll have to look at with regard to the placement of fill and the settlement, because adding load accelerates settlement. So there really isn't somewhere in there an engineering breakpoint for how to best do this. And I think that's the what to do and how to get it done in the long term is really the design challenge for Mariners Village. Anything else? Okay. Sorry, so I lead myself. So in terms of design challenges and the site setting, again, a very low-lying neighborhood, right? So we know the marsh at the outboard edge of the community here is about 6 or 7 feet. The backyards of people's houses are in the 8 to 9 foot range around the edge of the property. So as we see water levels up above 8 feet, we see it crossing onto Golden Hine and into the community. I spoke a little bit about the bay mud loading and settlement. So we have some graphics later that illustrate how much bay mud is out there, but you can see from the location that it's right on the edges of the marsh fringe. It was historically marsh, and some of the bay muds extend beyond 100 feet in depth. So they're essentially bottomless bay muds, which is also a somewhat unique setting. Then the sea level rise design standards. So they're already high, and they're rising. So it really becomes an issue of how do we keep pace with sea level in this community, which is both sinking and subject to sea level rise. So that's where phases, as Kelly said, would be something we want to envision here, the foundation of infrastructure for work in the future. High-value wetlands, we talked about Corte Madera Ecological Reserve in the marsh. There are endangered and other special status species in the marsh. So there will be extraordinary protections that will be required. We work in that context all the time. I'm specialized in kind of the green edge of water and wetland restoration. So we understand what the pros and cons are of working there. And that, as Kelly mentioned earlier, is really important because we need to early on vet our concepts with the resource and regulatory agencies. So we bring them to them in an informal way, or we ask them to come to stakeholder meetings to participate early on. And with their support, then we identify a project that's permittable. And then hopefully we then maybe possibly even ask those state and federal agencies for money to build it. and then the barrier alignment. So in this portion of Mariners Village, we're looking at a coastal flood protection barrier in the backyards of homes on the edge of the marsh. If we thought we could push out into the marsh, we might try. But I don't know whether or not, and I suspect that we cannot. So at this point, our thinking is that to minimize impacts to wetlands, that work would be done in a right-of-way in the backyard of the neighborhood.
And just to that point, with the geometry in the rear yards, a lot of the property lines back there, they're very straightforward. It just goes straight across. But what people have done with their backyards over time, there's quite a bit of irregular geometry. Some people will have very little in the way of improvements in their rear yards. They have pickleweed that comes up to their decks, essentially. So choosing an alignment, it'll most likely be a couple options of alignments to look at are going to be really important. I think it's going to be rather tricky too. If you look at the area around, let's say, maybe 275 Golden Hind, 279, where they have nice rear yards that they've developed over time, ensuring that we understand that they have some nice improvements and how to work with those and try to retain as much as we can of the existing improvements back there. So there may be a point where it's an optimal solution where there is going to be some wetland impact just because you can't avoid it. With the neighbors who haven't built up their rear yards, some of them who have built up their rear yards, it may be a little bit easier. But essentially, one option is to have some sort of flood control or drainage easement back there for the wall. But with the alignment, it's going to be tricky with a lot of the irregular geometry back there.
It's going to be a very customized design. Kelly, do you want it? Shall I? Or?
Yeah.
So quite a bit of data has been gathered about the neighborhood over the years through a series of studies that have been done for the Stormwater Master Plan and for other planning intents. This map consolidates a bunch of information, but is Miller Pacific's map of bay mud thickness. So the orange lines and I believe are largely contour lines.
The blue.
Oh, I'm sorry. The blue lines are contour lines, and the orange lines are city parcels and streets. The dots are borings where they collect geotechnical information. And the thing to pay attention to are these blue contour lines, which are the bay mud depths. And so you can see each contour line has a number associated with it, and that's actually the measured depth of bay mud below that point. So out here, we're looking at 110 feet of bay mud. And I can't see it.
The interval is 10.
Turn around and see it here.
The interval is 10 feet. So
okay, so each one is 10, 190, 80. And so here's 80. Here's an 80-foot contour of bay mud.
Here's the 50, where anything past here is forecast to settle for another 90 years or so.
Yeah. So
you see it's
to generalize, I'd say the 50-foot contour maybe wraps, you can find the line, but this is about the 50-foot contour, and then everything bayward of that is really in very deep and unstable bay mud. That we need to understand that at the edges and understand our loadings so that we don't create geotechnical instabilities out there for the community. Associated with that map is an estimate of the consolidation and settlement rates associated with construction on the bay mud, and this also was developed by Miller Pacific Engineering. And they estimate these consolidation rates based on the characteristics of the material and the fact that about 8.5 feet of fill were placed on the bay mud in 1958 when the community was built. So they do a boring and they actually measure that depth. And it varies from place to place. The important thing to look at is, here's the calculated settlement to 2006, so that's already under the belt. We've already accommodated that, or we're working to balance that. And then the total settlement here. And so the important thing to recognize is that you want to take a look at the difference between what's 2006 and total settlement. So at the 60-foot contour, in 2006, we had this 4.3 foot elevation, and then, that's how much consolidation we had, and the total consolidation will be 5.7 feet at the end of the settling or the stacking of the mud. So we're looking at another 1.5 feet of consolidation. And really, there's no difference in terms of coastal flood protection between sea level rise and consolidation of bay mud, because it's just a relative departure between the water surface elevation and the ground surface elevation. So one of the things that we developed for the previous studies to bring you today is some flood frequency statistics, current flood frequency statistics for the community. And you can see, so we use these numbers to estimate essentially what the predicted maximum water surface elevations would be associated with different storm events. The number you should probably look at most is the 100-year flood exceedance level, which is a 1% chance of exceedance, so 1 in 100 chance in any given year. And that elevation is 9.7 feet. So that's the baseline FEMA number plus freeboard. So that's the elevation of the levee crest if we looked at FEMA plus freeboard alone with no sea level rise. We'd be at 9.7 and 1.5 feet or 2 feet, 3 feet if we really have to hold our breath.
I can go back to that.
Sure.
I just wanted to bring up something related to last year. And we discussed it at one point when we actually had the the NOAA charts, and it was exciting back then to see what a 10-year storm plus a king tide would actually do to the water surface elevation. And it was measured at the Richmond station, 8.1 feet. So what that means to the neighborhood, a lot of the stretch just a little bit north of ebb tide and going down a little further south past Tradewin, a lot of that swath in the front yards of houses, definitely in the backyards, but you're talking elevations below 8. So that's where, in those instances, with the king tide and the storm on top of it and the storm surge, we were seeing the water come through the side yards, in pretty good volume. So that's where this project is important, and that's what we're seeing today, is that it doesn't take a large storm event like a 100-year storm or just a once in 50-year storm to really cause some havoc out there. We're seeing that 10-year storms with a large tide is already causing impacts in terms of flooding. So with it forecast to only get worse the next 10 years, that's why this stretch of Golden Hind and this stretch of Mariner's Cove is really important to start getting analyzed and start getting it prepared for actual construction.
So on top of that, we have to lay sea level rise expectations or standards. And there's, in the past year, while there used to be a large disparity of guidance, everything seems to be converging. State and federal guidance is converging, and that's really helping planners and engineers work on coastal problems. In the state of California, the guidance and design standards look at different time frames now. So because sea level rise is time dependent, we're looking not just at rates, but at basically time marks. So what does 2050 sea level rise look like? 2100 sea level rise look like? And so we design for those time horizons, which is, this kind of doubles back to the project goals and how we present the goals of the project and where and how we are going to meet those horizons.
While you're on this one, Marin County produced a sea level rise report in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Were those the same standards that California uses?
Yes.
And if and when California updates theirs, are they automatically updated at the local level I imagine they're going to change yearly or twice.
This is how they get updated at the local level. The regulatory community requires the designs comply with the state standards. So in this case, for example, BCDC, the state agency, or the State Regional Water Quality Control Board would require the project meet state standards. And then their permits actually come before the county's grading permit.
Okay, because I'm imagining with these numbers changing perhaps every year, every 2 years, it would be good for the town to have an outward-facing website or information of this is what the current forecasts are and this is the source of them, just so you can find sources that say sea level is going to be much higher or much lower than these numbers. But I think if people are clear that there is a standard and it's predictable, then that will be more comfortable for people.
I think that information and communicating those facts to the public along the way is really valuable. And I think the communities really seem to appreciate it when we bring them to the neighborhoods. So from the standpoint of this project, we're suggesting that we shoot for 2050 design standards. That's a 30-year design life, essentially, if we got it done by 2020. And that would require us to put another 2 feet on our crest elevations to get there. The federal regulations, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA, and we will engage with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This will be a federally regulated project because there are endangered species in the Corte Madera Ecological Reserve marsh, and therefore it will require consultation and work with the Corps of Engineers. And their requirements, they require that you evaluate a range of scenarios, but that you design for the highest. And so for 2050, we'd be looking at 1.5 feet or 2 feet, the state standards. They may go as high as 5 feet by 2100, but I would not recommend that we design toward 2100 because we have consolidating bay mud and low-lying properties. So in this project, we're going to look at the biggest increment we can take on at a time, essentially, in that alignment for engineering stability, cost, and geotechnical safety, and flood control. So those are the
And also, one other thing is adaptability of the design is going to be something that we're really going to be pushing for and looking as a criteria, meaning that we can go up to a certain elevation now, but setting it up design-wise that we can add on to it later. It's possible. It's been done before. It's nothing new, but given the ranges of projected sea level rise, hopefully it doesn't occur, and or at least to the extent that it's been forecast, and it gives us a little bit more time to put on the extra height. But it's something that we can sort of plan for, gauge with, data coming back as far as what mean sea level has done. Obviously, I think in the next couple of years, the National Tidal Data MEPIC is going to recalibrate mean sea level, so we'll know in the last 20 years how far sea level has actually come up. So those are the things we'll be looking towards, and obviously adaptability of the design is probably a cost-effective way of going initially, and also gives us the chance to address something that if it does accelerate it or at a rate that was unplanned, we can make provisions for it.
Should I continue? Do you want to speak to past projects?
Yeah, so there have been attempts before at the barrier out here, and I just want to show these conceptual alignments that were done probably back in 2006 or so.
So this red line is the conceptual alignment.
The red line is conceptual, the dashed line is the property line. So it was shown in further towards the property line. One potential is that it could be put on the rear, through our planning department, there's a rear setback line for all properties back here. So it could be put on the rear setback line to give a little bit of buffer and stay out of the environmentally sensitive area as much as possible. That way, within the setback, they'd be allowed to build and do other things on their property, but beyond the setback, it would be reserved for flood control. it's a thought right now, but that may have been one of the ideas in this alignment right here. As I understand from this past project, and I call it a project in the sense that it was developed as far as a design concept. As I understand, one of the things that was difficult in ultimately implementing it was the height of the wall. The wall was planned on being, I've got to do the math, but it was elevation 13.7 when you have ground levels back there that are somewhere in the order of 7.5, 8. You're talking about a 6.5 foot wall in people's rear yards. So that's where there was quite a bit of opposition to doing that. But seeing as now with the sea level rise estimates, the FEMA maps the firm maps that were reintroduced in 2016 showed base flood elevation rose a foot. They redo the flood insurance studies every 5 years. We're on year 2, so probably in another few years they're going to do another flood insurance study, and who knows where base flood elevation goes from there. So the higher elevations for the top of wall are they're going to be maybe not on that order of 13.7, but they're probably going to be between 12 and 13. So they could be between a 4 and 5 foot wall in the rear yard. But again, we'll have to go through the design standards, the analysis to really figure it out. But
And also, it's important to recognize that it's not just a freestanding wall. It's a wall, and then we're grading the property up to that. And we have some pictures later, but they're very aesthetically pleasing from the yard side. It will change people's line of sight from being, right across the marsh. I mean, I look back there and I'm like, wow, that's beautiful. It's like an infinite yard out into the marsh. So that would change in order to provide that flood protection. But we would encourage people to grade up to, the infrastructure, or we will leave a finished grade essentially behind the wall. And the wall typically, in a residential setting, we very frequently put a concrete cap on it. So it's a finished edge from the side of the home. So we're very attuned to the aesthetics from both sides.
and realize, this
We're just
it's a waterfront community, so there are people with docks, water access, different elements like that would have to be looked at and incorporated.
Mhm. Here's more of the alignment.
Yeah, there's more of the alignment, and this really.
This is the
There-
lowest area.
Yeah, that's the lowest area in there, and you can see some of the houses with, I'll just call them undeveloped rear yards. And so in this concept, they really took a straight line, and it does make sense to a certain point that they took some of the rear yards that were built out. It's almost the mean of where they come out, and they shot straight across, and they used that one rear yard that was significantly developed and use that as a returning point to continue up. But as you can see, like I pointed out earlier, right past the jog, you can see people's rear yards and how they're somewhat irregular. So this will all have to be evaluated and worked out in conceptual design as we move forward. That's where it's going to become really, really important with resident and public outreach.
Mhm, I agree. And the mitigation aspects of this will also become very important. So anywhere where we impact existing marsh, we'll have to develop a strategy to mitigate for that. And that strategy will have to be incorporated in the design so that the design can be permitted. So we want to minimize that obligation. So just kind of wrapping up, so the preliminary study concept that Kelly and I have been talking about, and we've been looking, we've been discussing some different ideas, but just wanted to show you some work that we had done over at Seadrift Lagoon, repairing a bulkhead and that boat ramp after that. But you can see the work in the middle shot, which probably could be bigger. You can see here's, so here, this is actually framing the concrete cap. but this is the sheet pile wall that was driven in from the backside. You can see all the equipment access came in behind people's homes. So we had narrow equipment behind the homes, and they drove the sheets, and then there's backfill here. In Corte Madera, we probably need lightweight fill or something of that nature. And then you can see here is a finished cap with a concrete top. There's a walkway over it. You could do it, you could put a dock back over it. So that would be the idea conceptually of a sheet pile retaining wall behind residential houses. There's a lot of other ways to do it. This is just one example, but what it looks like in the alignment. And when it's done, it looks very neat and clean. I think we would probably want to create some transition zones so that the vegetation comes right up to the edge of the wall. But that's a negotiation with the regulatory agencies and the resource agencies, because we'd be filling or disturbing wetland to create, a more elevated marsh edge. So they would have to want to do that, or we wouldn't do it. So those are the kinds of considerations that go around in the conceptual design process. So in the short term, for the lowest lying sections for Mariners Village, I think we really want to look at some temporary flood protection measures, something we can do either before very large tides or storm events, but nothing that would really reflect permanent infrastructure on the landscape. We want to try and get it down there in the next year, or as fast as we can. And then in the long term, we're looking at options for shoreline revetments with engineered fill, and it may be a metal sheet pile, it could be an earthen fill, but it's very clear from the geotechnical limitations of the bay mud that minimizing the amount of fill that we place out there is going to be one of the strongest constraints we have to comply with. So the sheet pile wall is the kind of least fill.
So can you give an example of a temporary measure you could take?
Sure. I didn't bring any pictures today, but there are geotextile tubes that you can fill with water that make for temporary dams. You can take K-rails, those plastic road dividers, you can fill those with sand, and you can do some not very pretty improvements. And then there are some pretty fancy now temporary flood protection things that Kelly and I have been looking at, where they kind of roll out. They're anchored, they fill as water flows toward them, and then after the storm, they can be removed. So there's a variety, and then there's sandbags, there's localized fill, just looking at each individual property and saying, how can we button you up, that sort of thing.
And I've taken a look at the water filled, I'm just going to call them bags, but for lack of a better term, I'll come up with a better one. Geotubes. But so essentially, one of the great things about them is that they come in a variety of sizes, and they can be cut to length. And it only takes about 2 people to roll them out, and fill them up and cinch them up. So deployment is really, really quick. You take water from your garden hose. If king tide's coming, you can come, lay them out, fill them up, and have some protection out there. The great thing about them too is that once the tidal cycle is receded and you go back to more of a normal tide cycle, you can let the water out, dewater in a safe manner, and you can roll these up and put them in your garage or wherever you choose to store them. I think one of the go-to solutions of late has been to use sandbags, but with the sandbags, even though they have bags that resist UV degradation a lot better, still, it's a lot to bring in the sand, it's a lot to fill the bags, it's a lot to actually store the bags, plus you just can't pick them up and put them in your garage readily. So I do have some product information. I talked with the supplier of the geotextile tubes, and they do have pricing. And from what I recalled, it seemed fairly reasonable. It didn't seem like as an absorbent cost for these. So in a temporary measure, if people were looking to protect or keep the water out of their backyards, that is a possibility. Also, I've seen plastic plastic blocks or cells that you could put sand into that kind of weight down, and they last, or they act as just a more substantial temporary berm that you could leave out there, probably in the order of a couple of years or so. So there's temporary solutions that could be deployed in the near term, and there's temporary solutions that could be employed now and left in place for a while. So there are options, because this process of going through concepts and environmental review, final design, construction, I mean, it could take up to 3 to 5 years to ultimately get something built. That's if there's no opposition. So given that long of a time horizon, viable temporary solutions will be a key for people to use if they so choose.
So somehow trying to mimic these short-term solutions as far as the deploying them when needed versus having them permanently. Could the long-term solution incorporate some of those features, as opposed to being a static structure that will always have a certain height and will, in a way, block the view of the residents, to have some of a dynamic component so that it may raise and go down depending on the needs?
I think initially you're going to need some foundation and an alignment.
Yep.
But once you have that foundation and alignment, it may be that it's built to accommodate, temporary measures, so that we build the first, iteration of this wall at the height, and then when it starts to become inundated frequently again, we have an alignment for the temporary measures, right? And that gives us time. There's a possibility that, if things are accelerating faster than we can build,
I understand what you're saying. I don't think that's where I was going. Maybe where I was going is too fancy and not implementable or too expensive. But what I understand that you're saying is what Kelly referred to before, which is you plan for a facility that can adapt and grow in the future. So you have your alignment and your foundation on a certain height, but you design that foundation and that base so that you can build upon it in the future. But every time that you build, it would be a permanent new height. What I was suggesting is to have the alignment on the foundation and then some sort of short-term dynamic feature that can go up and down depending on the need, on the water elevation, so that you wouldn't have a permanent elevation wall in front of you if there's not really needed. Now that would require, it would be expensive to build and then to maintain. There would be some sort of rollers or whatever solutions, but
I hear what you're saying. I've actually thought of that, where you'd have some sort of, it would be able to float up.
Yes.
And adapt as the water actually came up.
Right.
Preventing sort of any water intrusion in whatever slot. There probably would need to be some sort of slot, whether it's some sort of, sheet metal or stainless steel, I guess, barrier that would be on some sort of, something that would allow it to float up to prevent water intrusion. But I mean, that's definitely it's a very, very interesting idea, and I have thought that could be something. That would be the ultimate in adaptability.
Right.
Right.
It will react depending on the actual need, and so you don't have that constant height always there.
We can certainly look for those.
Yeah, I know it's
alternatives. There are things evolving all the time, because people are scrambling like crazy to try and solve this problem all over the place. So we certainly can look at innovative technologies. We would love to.
Thank you.
I think that's all I have today, but available if there are any other questions. I'm sorry, that's all I have today, but I'm available if there are any other questions.
So Kelly, one thing you mentioned is that Ramon has brought up a couple times the idea of outreach and making sure we get that right. And I think in our capacity on the board as the voice of the community and trying to imagine what people who actually live in those homes and own those homes might be thinking, I think probably second to family, your property is sort of sacrosanct, and you could get a lot of pushback for building on someone's property. So I'm thinking of foreseeing the questions that people might have who live there. The first one that comes to mind is, can Corte Madera force us to build on our property? And second would be, will they force us to build on our property? Cost, obviously, whether the city or an owner would have to be responsible. We didn't talk about that here, and I think we don't know, but I think this is a hard conversation to start without any answer to the public of whether or not they might be on the hook for a portion of this. So we need to think about that sooner than later. The when, I think we've heard some of that we could do temporary solutions soon, but if it's major construction, people are going to want to know when. And the one I say for last, which you could actually put first, is what if I refuse? What if we have all the landowners except for one, and somebody says, I don't want you building on my land, and we have to understand the legal framework for what's going on and how far the town is willing to go to get something like this done. And that's, I think, what Ramon and I both have thought is a very thorny issue that we're getting into here, is we're, getting on people's property. So I think we should think about that and be prepared to answer it sooner than later. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think that's part of the outreach, is being prepared for some very hard questions.
No, I understand. I mean, this isn't necessarily an easy solution by any stretch of the imagination, and for those reasons in particular. And I mean, when you're talking about people's property, I mean, it's very important that we approach it in a respectful manner and, really go to them. And I think making the case, because ultimately what you'd want to do is the least impact environmentally would be to request an easement. That's easier said than done, because, in this case, you may have 20 easements that you need to grant. You might have to have an alignment and show them, okay, are you willing to give up this 10 feet of land to be able to develop on, or not so much develop on. I mean, if it's outside of their setback, then that's kind of a moot point. But still, you're encumbering their land. It's on their title, but also making the case that this improvement is a net benefit, not only for them and their homes, but also the infrastructure for the town and the sanitary district. And it's really going with a thoughtful approach to why you need the easement. And if there were people who didn't want to entertain the thought, then we'd have to move to whatever alternates we could think of. Whether in some cases you bump out the alignment to be outside of the property line, and obviously that's more marsh disturbance. Who knows if that kicks you into a full EIR? Those are other options. The word was thrown out, forcibly take. That's pretty dire, but obviously you have to look at every possible solution and assess its viability. And one thought is, if our infrastructure is getting damaged and causing the town, incurring maintenance costs over replacement costs over just perpetual, year over year constant maintenance, and that becomes a problem in itself. And the benefit of some sort of structure that may ultimately lead to some sort of eminent domain, questions, and talking with the attorneys and find out the best way to approach it from that standpoint. I think for us right now, that's really on the back burner. I think our approach is to really work with everybody and try to partner with everybody and explain it as best we can of why we need it. And like we said in the beginning, choosing the alignment is going to be really, really important, because that's going to dictate where the easement's going to be. Maybe it's something if there's obviously going to the rear of the property line, it's going to be more impactful to the wetlands out there. But if for some reason it's proven to be, kind of a wash environmentally because we're already impacting some of the wetlands, then keeping it to the furthest part of their property, maybe that's a livable solution. So I think for us, the strategy would be to work in a partnering sense, try to come up with something that's livable for everybody, and work to get consensus and get everybody on board. But that goes with all the people who are in favor of the project in those homes to really work with their, whoever may be, less inclined to get on board. We'd ask the homeowners who obviously understand the impacts, to really help get other people on board and, come to some sort of compromise, come to something that's livable back there. So, obviously, there are a few different options as far as getting the easement, getting consensus back there. But yeah, I agree with you. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to be something that has to be really, really well thought out and well planned, and ultimately well delivered.
But adding to what Nate was saying, I think that I agree with you that the approach that you described when referring to how to present to the community, and it's definitely a win-win situation, I think, because the ultimate beneficiaries or the primary beneficiaries are going to be the homeowners there that will not have their properties flooded and damaged. But having said that, we all acknowledge that there will be some potential reticence to both have some of the property permanently or temporarily encroach upon, and second, to have to pay for it. So, whereas I agree 100% with the approach that you described, I think that before anybody from the town goes to talk to the community, there needs to be an in-house serious talk about why the town is doing this. Is it to protect a certain part of the town? Is it to protect other town assets and maintenance? Is it to protect the sewer district? And, as Nate said, to evaluate to what length the town is willing to go. There needs to be an internal in-house assessment. When we go to eminent domain, if the case dictates it, so as opposed to play reactive based on the response to the community, I think that the overall plan of why this is needed and to what extent the town is willing to go to ensure that the community at large, not only those property owners, but the rest of them are properly protected, how far is it going to go? As opposed to be reactive to it.
Chair Bundy, members of the board, just a couple thoughts quickly in hearing this conversation. So, hearing from Mr. Garcia, the short answer to your question, the why we're doing it, there's around $500 million worth of property here, and it's privately owned. So the town doesn't own anything that's worth $500 million. So the single most important reason for this project is to protect private property. And so if the property owners, and I agree with you all, you're having an intelligent conversation, we don't need to answer these questions tonight because we're just at the beginning of outlining a study and proposing some potential solutions to the problem, which is flooding of residential homes. So that's the issue that we'd be trying to solve. We're not going to get 100% of the, I don't know, Kelly, if you know how many homes are in here, 300 or 400 homes and property owners. We're not going to get 100% of them on board to support this. But we do have to do some education, and we do have to let them know that, while, Kelly's right, there is some town-owned infrastructure and some sanitary district-owned infrastructure that could benefit from this. It doesn't come close to the value of the private properties. So, we will have to do some outreach. We don't have to have an internal discussion as to what the primary reason is. We know what it is. It's private property. So, we would never build there today. What decisions were made and the thought processes from 1950 through 58 are much different than they are today. So in terms of if we were to look at sustainable design, we may promote an alternative to return this whole area to marshland and wetland. And I'm sure the property owners out there wouldn't like that proposal at all. So somewhere in between those two, there's a solution out there But you're right. You're all right. We're going to have some community outreach. We're going to have to do some education. We're going to have to talk about a lot of things you heard in the slideshow tonight, along with, I mean, FEMA, for example. We reference FEMA, but I don't know if you all know this, but FEMA is not the most cutting-edge organization. There were 3 500-year floods in a row in Houston, including this year, so 2015, 2016, 2017. Anyone who understands statistics say there's not a 1 in 500 chance of something happening 3 times in a row. And between 2000 and 2010, they had 6 100-year floods in Houston. So there's lots of examples. We're in a dynamic climate time now. We're dealing with a very complex issue that hits the ground home locally in this neighborhood. So we'll have those meetings, we'll have those discussions, and the council will decide how much resources they're willing to put in. There will be proposals for private property owners to contribute. As Kelly said, there will also be a strong effort on the staff level to seek all the outside funds we can get. So it'll be a partnership. If this project comes to fruition, my guess is that it would have to be because many, many different parties came together to solve the problem.
Kelly, how much money are we putting towards this effort before we go out and take the pulse of the homeowners in the community?
Well, I mean, we haven't spent anything as of yet. So we do have a budget item for $150,000 for a study for this year. So that's what we have to actually get things off the ground and, start getting a project team assembled and, really start to gear up on what the outreach components are going to be, what information needs to be gathered, and start that. But we haven't gone down that road yet. As Board Member Garcia mentioned, there going to need to be some internal staff level discussions about next steps and really start to form this and push forward. So, I imagine at the floor board we'll before we actually go into procuring someone and starting to assemble a design team, we'll have another discussion at least, about this before we really move forward.
I'm asking because Bob and I were on the board when this project got proposed, whenever, I forget what, 2006, and it was vehemently opposed by the homeowners. And I know today it's different, we're in 2018, and maybe there may or may not be some of the same homeowners, but what would stop them from suing the town, like happened on Lucky Drive? I just don't want to go down this path and have this room full of people, which it was, with all the drawings up on the wall, and people saying, not a chance.
Yeah.
I'm not doing it.
Well, that's why we really wanted to make the people who are directly affected, meaning the homeowners that the improvements would be on, I mean, they'd be the first wave of outreach, and that's where we'd really want to engage and have discussions with them as far as, okay, here's what we're planning on doing, here's why we're doing it, here's the need, here's the benefit, and really have a lot more information for them to have. Unfortunately, I wasn't here in 2006 to understand what was conveyed to them or if anything was conveyed to them at that time. But I think the best we can do, meaning the staff, is to really arm them with as much information and come up with a thoughtful approach as to why we want to do this. And obviously, I think our heart's in the right place. I mean, when you go down there last year and see the roads closed because the bay water's coming in from the side yards and running down the street without bound, that's where maybe I'm not sure if that occurred in 2006 where you had bay water coming in through the side yards, but maybe now 12 years later, maybe it's a little bit more apparent that, okay, this is real. This is actually happening. Settlements reveal, we can see it. The elevating water surface elevation is, that's a real thing. I just think over time, it's hard when you don't actually see it and someone tries to tell you that there's a problem. But once you actually see the problem reveal itself, hopefully that's the motivation. But again, I think that initial outreach is going to be critical. It's going to be crucial to let them know what we're planning on doing and how we want to involve them. And hopefully, I mean, you bring up a good point, because I think it's the lesson learned 2006 and why it didn't get done. What, for the people who weren't out there, what was the problem? What didn't you like? What would work better? But also conveying that, all right, flooding is now occurring, so.
I don't disagree with that, but out of all the homes that line the water, how many are affected? Because I can see on down Golden Hind, the homes don't flood, and they go, I get it that those homes flood, but my house isn't affected, so why do I care? And I don't live on the water, so I'm not saying that I'm part of this, but, so how many of those homes?
Right now, I'd estimate, probably a dozen or so.
Okay,
It
yeah,
really
it's
goes up to
not
about,
a lot.
where you have the more substantial rear yards, like, like 279, they've really built up their rear yard. Maybe tying into the improvements there, maybe that's a stopping point, but it's around a dozen. I mean,
Yes, so that to me isn't a lot of homes. So what those dozen people might say is, I'm gonna raise my house. I'll spend the X amount of money that it costs. I'll raise my house. I'm now out of it. And I may or may not care about my neighbors. I'm being kind of a devil's advocate here, but I'm just trying to foresee the problems that we're gonna have. And I agree with a thoughtful approach and all that, but that may not match the reality of the way these people react, the way the homeowners react. And 12 homes is not a lot of homes out of the 400 and some odd homes in that community.
Sure.
Right.
I think the other considerations that we take into account are obviously, are the other infrastructure that's in the ground. But also, the other thing we have to think of is, response times for public safety. When you close roads, you have to have a detour. They're planning on getting down a main street like Golden Hind, and they have to go down Tradewind Passage and figure out how to do a loop around just to get to the upper ring of Golden Hind. That's where, having roads closed, and if it's a more frequent event, that's going to be a real problem. And, you talk to those guys, response times are everything. So those are the other considerations, when we think about keeping the water out of the street. Obviously, I think people raising their homes, I mean, that's just, it's a good sound idea just to make sure your space is protected. But also, the thing that we do have to evaluate too is keeping the water out of the roads, keeping it out of our infrastructure too, and think of it as total protection.
And I have to say, looking at the topography out there, there may be 12 homes that were affected this year, but it's 10 years before.
Pull the
rest-
mic a little closer.
I moved it away. There may be 12 homes affected this year, but that area of influence will be expanding and expanding. So it takes a long time to settle the dust around all of these issues, and starting in the lowest lying areas, I think makes sense to try. There are some really insurmountable difficulties that this project engages in terms of the private-public partnership that's necessary. Insurmountable is a wrong word, but challenging difficulties. But I think it's due diligence to start now with this community. That's I acknowledge Kelly's concern very directly, and I think knowing how long it takes to get these projects built, it really is it's necessary to start right away.
And other than the Seadrift project, have you worked directly with anything like this where a wall has actually been put up in another neighborhood similar to this?
Most of the work that I do doesn't actually involve, it has really oriented more toward the building of levees and softer infrastructure.
Okay.
Though a lot of work that Noble does is these types of retaining walls. So we will also be looking at living shoreline type solutions or some hybrid thereof. We really want this to be a blue ribbon project for the town and for the county. I mean, you guys are this is gonna take some pretty extraordinary measures because of the site setting, and I think that some special consideration. So it's not an easy solution.
And I think that in addition to the homeowners that will be directly affected by where this solution gets implemented, I think it's worthwhile for the town to evaluate how this is going to be funded. Not only trying to get funds from elsewhere, of course, but what portion of it will be funded by the town, and what is the town? Is the people living outside of this neighborhood? Is everybody within the neighborhood? Is it? I don't have any solution, of course. What I mean to say is that this needs to be thought out before, again, we reach out, because there's some homeowners within the large neighborhood that may not necessarily be affected by any of this, and there are some others that are indirectly affected. Maybe they have to pump a little bit of water from their basements, but and they will benefit. So who's going to pay for this? That delimitation needs to be.
Well, I know in the master storm drainage study back in 2007, there were different measures that were pointed out. Assessment districts were one of them, which you could, I mean, there's a process, but theoretically you could assess those, especially who are directly Bayside, for future improvements. But again, you bring up a good point. We need to know over the long haul what those actual improvements are before you actually levy an assessment on someone, making sure that there's actually going to be an improvement that goes right across their property. But evaluating how people benefit from this is going to be important as well.
That's what I think, that there's some homework that needs to be done before reaching out to the community, so that when we do, there's a background plan. Not that it doesn't need to be changed. It could very well be changed along the way with feedback and better science or better assessment, or whatever the case may be. But it's always better to have a plan before we open the Pandora's box.
Yeah, I think in simplest terms, people will ask the question, is this odd numbers on Golden High funding this, or odd and even? I mean, if you're across the street and your street's no longer flooded, and I think that's something important to be able to tell people during outreach. And if we're not there yet, it's something good to think about rather than shrugging to that one.
Right. It sounds like we're all on the same page about how critical this initial approach of the public is going to be, and whatever sort of deliverable we want to give them there's going to be a lot riding on the success of this deliverable in sort of communicating very clearly, here's the problem, without necessarily delving too much into granular data that the public is not going to read, because if you give them something they don't read, they're going to talk to their neighbors as if you didn't give them anything. So I think we're going to have to be very, very careful and really make sure that whatever it is that is the sort of piece that we distribute with this first outreach, has to be, it has to really walk a very fine line, I think, between making crystal clear that the problem is real, what is happening, give them all the information they need to know that we've been discussing, like ballpark costs, what they might be expected to contribute, lay out all of the great implications that we've been discussing, like emergency response times or town infrastructure, destruction of property, and the effect that sea level rise is going to have on their property values. So I think I'm wanting to see us really very carefully create a document that is extremely compelling without being inaccessible.
Essentially, something that relates to really everybody who's affected by it. So it's just not a technical,
right.
A technical document.
Exactly.
And you spoke a little bit about looking in this early phase at alternatives, and were you just speaking of alternatives of different ways for a structure that goes essentially from K Passage to ebb tide, or were you looking at larger alternatives for longer term solutions?
Yeah, this, in my mind, this is more of a near term. This project is, so I was speaking directly to that. But obviously, as I touched on earlier too, is that the levee system as a whole, it's in terms of what sea level rise is projected to be, plus the current FEMA base flood elevations. I think a lot of the levees in front of the Golden Gate Bridge Transit District property, I think they're actually at or above base flood elevations. That's a good thing. But as far as adapting to sea level rise, that's something that's going to have to be looked into. So I think eventually this is going to be, a phased approach. As far as the alternates go, It's really for this piece right here. And again, as I touched on earlier, it's, if there's an easier or a less involved environmental process for doing this stretch as opposed to doing a full-blown EIR for the rest of the levees, then it may make sense to just enter into that and really focus on this piece and protecting this piece right now.
I'd also like to add in from an ecological standpoint. I think Rachel mentioned, and thank you for coming, by the way, mentioned early on in the presentation that one of the goals of this project would be to maintain the ecological value or health of the environment out there. I would love to see, I mean, Peter touched on the fact that there was just huge monumental environmental damage that went into the creation of these neighborhoods, and yes, now we have somewhere to live. So that is what it is, but it would be great. I would love to see us as a board sort of steer this project towards not just having no impact, but maybe actually having a positive impact. I think that should be kind of one of the central missions of Flood Control Board.
Keith, you have any comments?
I was just going to echo Eli's suggestion about bioremediation as a goal, as opposed to a slab steel solution. I think there's a lot of funding available by the conservation groups and that are really trying to help biohabitats thrive, not just get hammered.
And that really helps us build a coalition to get behind this project and power it forward. I think if it's
Yeah, you can win awards.
right. I mean, it's
forth.
just more allies if you can also sell this project as something that's going to help further restore what was once these amazing tidal wetlands.
Yeah. Or protect and maintain, because what we see now is a lot of these coastal salt marshes, much of the Corte Madera Ecological Reserve will be inundated much more frequently. So we expect a tremendous amount of marsh loss, which is now giving rise to a 180 with regard to perspectives on wetland fill. So it used to be wetland fill was not allowed. And that was after years of wetland fill, right? We built all these communities, and then we realized we were short on wetlands and their natural resources. And so we reversed path, and we're essentially reversing again. But now we have the problem of this boundary, right, where community and public, private property meets these natural resources. So there are a lot of living shoreline type solutions. And I would love to present some of those that would be viable here, but it will require the resource and regulatory agencies' engagement, because it would involve disturbance along the edge. So we certainly would want to describe that. And in our presentation, I think one of the things that's really important is that the project be self-mitigating. In other words, at the very least, it balances the impacts and should do more if it can.
Any other comments? Rachel, I had a couple of things that I wanted to ask about. In relationship to these dozen homes or so that are impacted, many of them are in danger of, their thresholds of the house being impacted.
Finished floors.
And if the houses were raised up, that would sort of maintain the view looking out over some type of wall if we have to have that. One proposal that came many years ago when this was first being recognized as a problem was the idea of raising the houses and creating a seawall on the outside foundation, on the waterside foundation. The Army Corps of Engineers rejected that as too expensive because they factored in huge easement cost and then the cost of doing the whole project without any input from the homeowners. And a lot of us have either raised our homes and leveled them or made plans to do so. This is, a dozen homes that are impacted. Would that be, a potential solution? Is that something that could be looked at again in lieu of having seawall on the outer aspect of the property, then, the property could just slope out from the house or be landscaped as it is now, but, with the house at a higher level. Is that feasible?
We can certainly look at it. Sure.
Okay.
The primary concern I would have about raising the house is how to foot the foundation, because it's on day mud. There are some geotechnical issues there, but I think the feasibility of that can be evaluated with the feasibility of any other alternative that the community is interested in.
Well, people have been raising their homes. That number of homes in my part of Golden Hind have been raised because they were getting to they'd had so much settlement, and there was some tilt also that they needed to level the homes, but they also needed to get it up above that. And these were done primarily with pony walls on top of the existing foundation. What we're talking about would require a re-engineering of the posterior foundation, but that still might be less total weight than the wall and the landscaping that would need to make it look right. So I think that might be, something to really look at.
Certainly.
The other thing I was going to say to Stephanie is the outrage or the concern in 2006 when this came out. These were very unappealing walls and very high, as Kelly pointed out, and they were going to be behind all the properties along the slough, the San Clemente Creek. So this was, 100 homes, so the cost was going to
Was
be
much more
astronomical.
far-reaching, yeah.
And this is a much smaller project that we're working on right now. And if the height of whatever needs to be put in to protect the homes, protect the street, protect the neighborhood, is such that it can be added to as time goes on, I think that's probably going to be much more acceptable than just having a huge monolithic wall out there. The other concern that I had with the wall, and I think Kelly alluded to it, was some people have pickleweed, in their backyards, which is technically wetland vegetation. So even though it's within their property line, is that something that has to be taken into account when doing
Yes,
this?
it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. The resource agency doesn't care who owns it.
Yeah, okay. I was concerned about that.
Yes, it is. The resource agency doesn't care who owns it.
Okay. So the other issues that we talked about are sustained living shorelines. Could you pull up the biggest overview of this thing from Google Earth of the?
Subdivision.
Yeah, that one.
Just go and start the slideshow.
Yeah, so the concern in looking, oh, great, thank you, that trying to protect along here, it's protected up to about right here. People have done some things themselves in their backyard and built it up to probably an elevation that, that would be acceptable. From the pump station down, they haven't, and so that's where we really need to focus. So the Corte Madera Ecological Preserve is all north of here, is that correct? And so is this part of the ecological preserve in here also? Okay. So the area of the levee protecting Marina Village that we're concerned about and we put sandbags out on is right along here, yeah, in this area, and that needs to be built up. This, I guess, is technically, it's not the Corte Madera Ecological Reserve, but it's supposed to be wetland, although it really isn't.
It's a stormwater detention basin with wetland.
No, that's that one there, right? The detention basin.
I think anything inboard of the levee.
Anything inboard of this levee is stormwater. So this whole area
That's
is
right.
wetland, but also serves as a stormwater.
Well, there's actually a gate right here that allows a certain amount of creek water to go through and then go into that detention basin. So here we have these existing levees that protect Marina Village, but because we've got this issue of wetland vegetation here, as well as, I guess, wetland vegetation in the detention pond, what is going to be the solution for raising this levee up to protect Marina Village?
Well, we don't know at this point what the best solution will be. In working with Kelly, we've looked at a range of alternatives that focus on working in the uplands, so essentially above the 7-foot elevation on the levee. Thank you. A range of alternatives in the uplands, and they range from geotextile reinforcements and adding fill along with geotextile to improve the slope, to block retaining walls to elevate the path. In those alignments, we're battling a little bit with the constraints of access and the width of the trail top, and how much that we have to raise the trail and it narrows. So if we use a geotextile solution, we can take a little steeper slope and we can raise it and still maintain an 8 to 10 foot top width. So that's what we're thinking, is it's going to be an earth and fill project, and the fill will be retained with some sort of geotechnical solution, whether it's segmented block walls or geotextile fabric, something of that nature.
Okay. And the idea of the living shorelines, I think, is really important. I think all of us sort of like the idea of enhancing the wetlands that we have. And when I first moved to my house, I could take this trail and go all the way around, and everybody, that was a common walking path. Well, that's eroded. These outer soft levees have given way. This opening here used to be about 50 feet. Now it's about 300 feet. And you used to be able to pick out a levee all along here that had been breached, and because those were soft levees, those have eroded. The BCDC has done some studies. The Public Works in Marin County has done some studies on trying to harden these outer levees to keep them from eroding. And that would be a great project to try to do with maybe some AA funds to harden those, add some sediment, which we know we need to have to help the wetlands accrete and build up. But that would be nice if that could be a part of this that would benefit the entire Bay Area, because we're enhancing the wetlands. But we're losing several acres a year of really good quality wetlands out there from storm surges and sea level rise. And we really need to do something about it. I know Roger Leventhal and the county is looking at some projects on that. So.
I would like to add something else, which is something that I have brought in the past when this project was first presented to the board with my presence in the board, which is any project is defined with its scope, schedule, and budget. And the scope of the project will need to be eventually defined. But beyond the technical scope, what is the intent of this effort? Are we going to create an advisory document that will be handed to the homeowners and said, we have identified a problem that you have, and we suggest that you implement one or more of these solutions? But it's up to you. It's your home. It's your things. Is it an advisory document that we present? Why are we doing this in the first place? And I think that that's a non-technical discussion that needs to be had, and if it has been had already, needs to be somewhat documented. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of it? Or what sort of document and what emphasis that document will be. Will it be mandatory? The results of the study will be mandatory because the town of Corte Madera needs to have this protection? Or again, are just a number of recommendations that the town kindly gives to some of its citizens?
Well, I think just to respond to whether it's going to be an advisory document or not, I would suggest doing that and just leaving it up to certain homeowners to do an improvement or not to do an improvement, because as I mentioned before, really the integrity of the whole system relies upon continuity, meaning you can't have a gap in it. You can't have a gap in the system, or else you're going to have the water continue flowing into the street. Whereas if people did do improvements to guard their home, that's fine. That's totally understandable, and that's well within their right to do it. This is really intended, and the purpose of it is to protect property, but also protect the town's assets, and keep the traveled way open.
Well, I think that this is something that it needs to be clear. As I said before, I mean, we need to have this discussion. It seems that the discussion was not necessary because the scope of the project was to help homeowners more than protect town property. So whatever the main goal or the beneficiary side goals are, need to be very clear understood. As Stephanie said, maybe one homeowner would say, thanks, but no thanks. I'll raise my home. I'm out.
May I speak to that?
Can we do that or not? I know that technically it would be not preferable that someone does that, but I'm not talking the technical solutions. I am guilty as charged because I was the one suggesting, why don't we do this fancy thing about the thing going up and down? We all want to find solutions, but before we find solutions, we have to step back and say, what are we trying to solve?
One of the approaches that we often undertake is, and one of the things that's necessary for environmental compliance under CEQA, is to look at what happens under no action. So in this case, we would be looking at inundation maps, inundation frequency maps or flood inundation levels in this community at different points in time, assuming whatever our design rate of sea level rise is and what we know the consolidation rate of sediment is. And then no action would essentially describe to the community the extent of flood inundation they could expect in 2030, 2050, 2100. And that is now, since 2006, IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, came out with their first comprehensive study on sea level rise in 2007. That's when people really said, okay, yeah, we really can't debate, what's happening with climate change and sea level rise. We shouldn't debate it technically anymore. The scientific community agreed in 2007. So I think that was in some way a turning point. Mm-hmm. And since then, public works, local and county, state, and federal have been looking for solutions, in a community way. And the local solutions can be, the interim measures can be a community support effort, right? People can do things on their property this year, tomorrow, and we can help with that. But where I was going is that if the study starts by looking at the setting, the site, the alignments, and those alternatives, and then identifies the opportunities and constraints for these alternatives, just in a non-specific, non-solution-oriented way, right? So what are the opportunities for protecting homes, right? And what are the constraints for doing that? A lot of times that consolidates a lot of the questions and information that the community has. One of the constraints is we need a contiguous structure. So what does that mean if we don't have full participation? And we start to lay those things down for the community, because Public Works is investing for the community. Mm-hmm. So I think we can do both. We can look at the long-term solution, and we can help the local property owner.
I don't know if that's exactly what I had in my concern. It is good that the process itself has certain features, like the do nothing alternative under CEQA. that will inform, that will force us to make certain research and investigation, and that will be used to show the community what will happen underneath. But I'm going beyond the process to implement a solution. That's something that we have to go through. But what I'm saying is that everybody here and elsewhere has the best intentions at heart. We want to do the right thing. And we have identified that there seems to be a problem in this area. Historically, we have had some problems. And it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So the whole concept makes perfect sense. But how we frame the intent and how we frame the town's obligation and how we explain why are we doing this, why are we investing money in the assessment, in the research, into the solutions. We have to be able to say what it is that we're doing and with what intent and what would be the extent and the power of the document that we create. Are we doing this because we have identified a problem and we want to be proactive and help the homeowners and their adjacent neighbors? Or are we saying, you guys gotta do this because this is the right thing to do and you must do it?
But the one thing that, you know, and I appreciate your comment, but the one thing just to add on that, and I just really want to reinforce, is that, yes, a lot of it is geared around protecting homes, but also when you think about it and what it's projected another foot by 2030, which is pretty close. You know, the settlement rates in Mariners Cove, I have a field shot, you know, field elevation that was taken, you know, a couple months ago compared with one that was taken 10 years ago. It's another, you know, 2 to 3 tenths lower. So over that range of time, you could have the ground subside another 3 tenths of a foot, and plus have sea levels come up a foot, which means, you know, your average high tides are actually coming over and inundating the street. So you may have for hours at a time, you know, street closures, meaning it's going to be difficult for people to access their homes. It's going to be difficult for other services to access those parts of Goldeneye. And that's where protecting the roads, protecting the infrastructure, and also, you know, protecting, you know, property is the.
Very, very well. That is a very good assessment. We are lucky to have our people that have thought about all those things. But that's where I think that we need to go. If we have identified that as a town problem, then it's different than if we have identified a particular homeowner problem. We have identified a town problem, and the town needs to tackle it. And we're going to do the best we can to do it for the community. That's one case. But if it's a town problem, it's everybody has to chip in a different way.
Just going back about 20 years ago, so High Canal Pump Station. So with Madeira Gardens, you know, with the floods in '82 and '98, I mean, Madeira Gardens is a low-level subdivision, and it used to rely on tides to allow the water that accumulated in Lagoon 1, Lagoon 2, and High Canal and Low Canal to actually get out. And that's what happened in '82, was that you had a high tide event and you had historically heavy rains where the capacity spread out into the neighborhood, flooded the streets, flooded homes. And there were a lot of losses. There were a lot of flood losses. So, you know, the town, you know, that's where the storm drainage tax was implemented. Measure C was passed by, I think, 1 vote. Then that ultimately funded High Canal Pump Station. And since High Canal Pump Station was implemented, there hasn't been a significant flood in Madeira Gardens. So this is analogous to this. This isn't a pump station that is necessarily going to save the neighborhood, but it's going to protect our assets. It's going to protect property. And they're really similar in what the town's involvement was to help put that forward and actually go through the steps to, you know, protect all those varying assets.
Everything that you have said makes sense to me. What I think that we need to know, the first thing that you have to do when you solve a problem is to figure out whose problem it is. So if it's a town problem or it's an individual homeowner problem,
May I speak to that for a minute? So, what we're dealing with in this specific location is a local problem, which is ubiquitous to the town. So, much of Corte Madera is low-lying, served by pumps, right? And is below gravity drainage. And how far below gravity drainage will continue, right? So the amount of pump capacity you need, the amount of head in each pump will rise, right? All your infrastructure is going to have to upscale, right, with these kinds of heads. So this project that we're talking about tonight is a very localized project. But this problem is something that's going to occur throughout this part of Corte Madera and throughout all of Marin County, where levees are typically somewhere between 9 and 10 feet.
All the more important to figure out the intent of the effort. Because
So-
if we do this right now here, and 10 years on, and we convince, or we can argue and articulate that the affected homeowners are those that need to have a special payment or more payment than others, or whatever it is, 10 years down the road, when this same problem happens elsewhere, then the other people are going to say, well, hold on a second, the whole town paying for those individuals, but now I'm paying for this, or the other way around. So that's why I think this needs to be thought out completely.
I think it's been stated at this meeting as to what our rough plan is to do. I mean, obviously, there's a shared responsibility. How much piece of the pie the homeowner is responsible for, the town, whomever, that's all in the process of getting figured out. But I mean, I think it was conveyed pretty clearly earlier that I think everyone has an interest in this, and everyone obviously is going to have a piece in this process as far as how it gets delivered monetarily.
Right, but I think that all these important questions that need to be thought and somewhat in-house addressed before we approach the community. Because if I'm the homeowner, I want to care not only about what you're going to do in my property, but if I'm going to pay for it or not. Because I'm very busy with my life. That's the only thing I want to know. Are you affecting my backyard, and do I have to pay anything for it? That's all I want to know.
Yeah, I agree, and I think everybody needs to understand, but in short, what we're saying is, if we looked at the high water of 8.1 feet, which created significant flooding in the community this past winter, or at least the start of it, last winter, time flies. And we look at 1.5 feet of sea level rise on 8.1. So right now, if we look at 7.1 feet, that's about the elevation of the outboard marsh right now, right? So about annually, right, we get high waters up there. And if we look at 8.3, oops, sorry, I clicked on it, I shouldn't have. If we look at this 8.3 elevation as approximately 8.1, we had about a 5-year storm last year. If we add a foot to that, then what we're seeing is something on the order of between 9 and 9.5 feet. So what we're going to see is what looks like a 100-year storm to our infrastructure, right? Every 2 to 5 years, if not more, depending on how much the past predicts the future. And we think the past predicts the future less and less all the time, right? We hear that. And so what we're trying to do is button up the edges where the community is at risk right now, and then use what we learn to formulate a broader plan. And part of that, I think, for the town and for the flood board will be determining what the goals of that project are and what are the design standards. Is it 2050, 2100, something in between? Because those obligations to maintain are something that town policy.
I think that before we establish a specific design criteria for a physical solution to implement, which is what we're talking about, we, the board, must understand why are we doing this, and what is the intent and the basis for the document that we are creating. Way later down the road comes the design criteria. If it's a 2050 horizon, is it this number elevation, is this number sinking, all those are details. And as I've said many times, the engineering will be worked out later. That's usually not the problem.
I think we're all in agreement on this.
We're all in agreement that there's an apparent issue that is real and that will get exacerbated in the future. But I don't understand. I for one still don't understand, and needs to be clear, I think, why it is that we're doing this. What is the eventual impact? And not on the technical solution. That will be sorted out throughout the process
I think the overarching goal is to protect this community
to protect this community.
Yeah.
and the private property within. I mean, that the public infrastructure is intended to protect the community.
And therefore, it's the town's obligations
It's,
to
yeah.
do whatever it takes to
When-
protect the property.
Usually when a final map is accepted by a municipality, oftentimes nowadays, there's in the owner's statement that, there's offers of dedication to roads, infrastructure, easements, and what have you. So when you sign on that and it gets recorded, you've accepted the maintenance responsibility for that infrastructure. And obviously, with the subdivision, we accepted those roads, Goldenheim being one of them, into our maintenance responsibility. Same thing with the sewers, the storm drains. Those are all town-maintained facilities. So maintaining those in good working order, making sure that the street's clear, those are all responsibilities upon the town by that document that was signed back in, 1960. So that goes to speak why it's really important when, subdivision maps come before anybody, you really understand what you're accepting, because in this case, like with Mariner Cove, you understand with the settlement and all the issues that, could happen with Bay Mud and building on Bay Mud. I mean, it is your maintenance responsibility, for the next however many years it survives. So that's what we're trying to look at, and we're taking the long view on trying to protect this for not tens of years, not scores of years, but 50, 100 years down the line. And that's what we're trying to achieve, is protecting that infrastructure, upholding our maintenance responsibility, but also protecting private property.
That I understand. I understand what you just said.
And I
The
think-
town has an obligation to inherit that infrastructure, and the town has an obligation to maintain it. And therefore, the town will do the studies and the analysis and come up with an optimal solution and work with the community, of course, to implement the solution. But I think that's a little bit different to the potential that I had in mind before versus doing something for the property
I
owners.
think we've done a couple laps around this issue, but you guys have answered 100 questions, and I think the two questions that Ramon and I have daylighted that you guys could work on before going to the community is who pays? Is it the homeowners? Is it the town? Who pays for it? And then what rights do property owners have? Because as Ramon said, if you're a property owner, those are the two things you care about. And it sounds like those two things haven't been worked out. So we assume that you'll go back and work on that issue. And obviously, we don't have all the answers tonight, but I think we've answered technically a ton of questions. So.
Just a
Peter.
couple final thoughts. First of all, dogged determination from this flood board in a lot of areas. We're not going to have the answer, with all due respect to that question, who pays. That's going to evolve over time. It's going to depend on how successful we are in getting grant funds. It's going to depend on things like whether our current special drainage tax assessment is repealed, whether the town votes to reassess themselves in terms of sales tax. A lot of those questions we don't know the answers to, and we won't for a while. So I wouldn't press too hard on who pays. I understand the need to and the desire to answer that question. But until we go after grants, until we determine what proportion of the town's resources can be dedicated to such an endeavor, and quite frankly, until we survey the neighborhood, we won't know the answer to that. I contend that it will be a combination of those. I don't know how much of which proportion will be paid by whom. And then in terms of Board Member Garcia's point that he keeps trying to make, I think that the best way to do it, if I could put it into metrics, would be current and future value of either property or assets. So if we were to create metrics for what the properties are worth, both as an individual, the average price of a parcel and a home today versus what they could be worth in 2020 and 2030 with the do-nothing scenario, versus what they could be worth if we were to build some kind of ultimate infrastructure to protect the property. That would give property owners an idea, a framework by which to determine their current and potential future value of their property. And we could do the same with town-owned infrastructure, whether it's pump stations, drainage, roads. The one that would be most difficult to do would be to value access. So if you imagine the flood and the inundation, when those begin to take out things like Paradise Drive, San Clemente 101 itself, let alone access to 101, the value you put on accessing the transportation system is much more difficult to come up with a concrete number. But just sitting here listening to you guys think about it and flicking through the different inundation maps, I don't think it'd be that difficult to come up with the first two, current and future values of private and town-owned infrastructure. That would be the metric, and I'll kind of go back to my prior point. The primary value here is in property owned, is private property. It's not in town-owned infrastructure.
But that would be that exercise would be the basis to establishing the percent or the allocation of the cost of the solution. Is that what you're saying? That would be
It would be a factor. I don't think that it would be necessarily the only factor. Because the town, say for example, one of those fee assessments or tax districts or sales tax measures, the town is going to have more resources in the aggregate than a private property owner will. So there's lots of different ways to skin it. But again, we're not going to know the answers for a while. We have some ideas, and I think you guys are right to ask these questions. But I just think it's going to take a little time to develop a few different scenarios to really understand what the best ways to go about it are. If you do some simple math, if you do something like, a $10,000 property assessment per property, and you phase it over 10 or 15 years, it's not a lot of money per parcel per person, but it can generate $4 or $5 million to contribute to the construction of a wall that would protect the entire community, from Paradise Road northward. So there's lots of different ways to do it, and I think we probably have discussed enough of it.
I don't think that the intent was to ask what is exactly the way to do it. I think the intent is that these thought processes need to be understood and discussed before I think we approach the community. And again, the most important thing is that why are we doing this? Who is the main beneficiary? Is it the homeowners, and therefore this is an
Yes.
advisory document, or
Yes.
is it the town, as you clearly explained, Kelly, and therefore it's a town obligation and a mandatory eventual solution with
No,
all
I
the-
don't think it is. I mean, the town isn't obligated to.
I don't know which one it is. All I'm saying is that it needs to be thought out.
I kind of know which one it is. I don't think that the town is obligated to protect every single parcel within it over the next 50 years. We just don't, it's not going to happen. We don't have the resources to do that. Again, if you look at, $500 million worth of privately owned property in here and town assets that total more in the tens of $20 million, it's no comparison, right? It's a 10 or 20 or 50 to 1 ratio of private property value versus town-owned value. That doesn't mean that the town shouldn't put in the majority of the costs. But those questions are going to be answered by council. We'll take this to council. We'll get direction from our elected officials. The primary purpose is to protect private property and access. And the private property is worth a lot more than the roadways. And how much you value access, again, I don't know. It depends on the person who, has to drive all the way around to Tiburon to get out of this neighborhood because Paradise Road and San Clemente are flooded. So.
Well said. One of the things that I comment to people on about my house being on the water is some of us that wanted waterfront property got more than we bargained for. And certainly the subsidence and sea level rise have really impacted that. So as Rachel said, this is a unique situation to this community, and particularly unique to the homes that are on the water through which the water passes to flood the streets. So raising your home will protect it from damage, but if you can't get into your driveway, because the street's flooded, then that also affects your property value too. So It really is important that we come up with something that is a continuous way to protect these properties. One of the other things that we didn't really talk about, but the levee, which is behind on the east side of the homes on Harbor, is, sort of a privately maintained levee, but it's a continuous levee from Paradise all the way to the existing levee that we want to maintain and improve. And we haven't figured out who's actually responsible for that levee and how to maintain that and make sure that it isn't breached. So these we've raised a lot of good questions. I certainly think the homeowners are going to have some responsibility financially because, we're really impacted. I think the rest of the community that's not as directly impacted, has some responsibility, less so. And I think the town also has a responsibility to try to organize this and put some money into it.
All that, as difficult as it is to quantify and to assess, including the solutions, it depends on the basis of the project. What are we trying to resolve? The need. As I described at the beginning, you first do the needs assessment of a project, and then you have the alternative analysis. The alternative analysis, the solutions, as you eloquently described. You can have a solution that solves one problem, which is the homeowners having water, and yet it doesn't solve another problem, which is the flooding in the street. So before you find the solutions, you have to identify what you're trying to solve. And when you're trying to identify what you're trying to solve, you also have to add, who is the beneficiary for this? Why am I doing this? Who is it for? And therefore, in a way, eventually, as complicated as it will be, how will the cost allocation be decided? But before you go into solutions, before you go into cost allocations, before you go into any of the technical components, as I have said many times, you don't apply the engineering first. You apply the social study first. What are you trying to do here? And once that you have that, then the engineering will come. The engineering it always comes. That's what we're here for.
I think those dozen homes or so that are most impacted and that need to have some type of barrier, either in the with the house, with the foundation, or with the backyard, will recognize and agree that we've got a real problem here. Water's coming around my house and flooding the streets or flooding my garage, and I would like to see something done that will keep the water out of the streets and, potentially keep my house from flooding. So I think the people that are in those houses now, they may have some different ideas about how much they should pay for this or whether they should pay anything, but I think they will recognize that we do need a variation or this exact solution to solve this problem. And so we've got to work on this community outreach, and we have to come up with some way of determining how it's going to get paid for.
I would suggest that we don't do any community outreach until we figure out what we're trying to solve.
Well, what do you see as the problem? What do you see as the problem that we should be solving?
What are we trying to do with this? Are we trying to solve an area that gets flooded now and will get more flood in the future? Are we advising the property owners that we, the town of Corte Madera, have identified this problem for your property, and we strongly advise that you do this, and we will help paying for this, but you have to understand that you will pay for it too? Are we trying to convince them that based on the science and the evidence that they have a problem and they have to address it and we will help them? Are we telling them that this is part of Corte Madera, and as such, we have a fiduciary obligation to keep and maintain the safety of our citizens and the access to the freeways and the access for first responders, and therefore, we are going to come with a fair way to implement a solution that is aesthetically pleasing, and there will be this sort of payment allocation right now for this, but in the future for other places along, elsewhere in Corte Madera. So what is that we are saying? convincing or not convincing. I can be the homeowner and say, oh, you're telling me that I have a problem with water. What do you think? I didn't know. I live here. I've been here pumping water since I was born. But if you want to solve it, by all means, solve it. Oh, you're telling me that I have to pay for solving it? That's a thank you. No, thanks.
Board Member Garcia, I hopefully it was clear enough, early on what I was trying to convey, and, going through the process. I know it was a while ago that slide came up, but really, before the initial outreach, what I conveyed to everybody is that this is going to come before a flood board for more discussion. This is really the preliminary discussion. We had kind of an impromptu discussion in September that wasn't agendized, and I agreed to get it on a future agenda so we could properly discuss it. I agree with you. It's going to take more discussion to get it right. I don't think it's the town staff's intention to just go out tomorrow with leaflets and dump them on people's doors. That's not what we're proposing. We're proposing, in future meetings, we're going to continue to discuss this. And I think everybody, from their feedback is communicated that, let's get it right. Let's have an opportunity to get it right. And the only way to really get it right is to have a little bit more discussion and kind of hone in on those things. So, I think an appropriate next step is, at a future meeting, agendize a portion of this discussion. This is a really broad, high-level discussion on the whole project, which is a piece of a larger actual project, meaning restoring all the levees. But if we can take it and break it up into parts and talk about the initial phases, what do we want to go in there, and we can really, really go into detail about what everybody sees as important pieces of communication and important information and facts to have. And like I had mentioned before, really start arming ourselves with the information to provide to them to make a case for these improvements, really give them a lot more of a leg to stand on, so to speak, to really understand before they go forward with the next step. So just to recap what I was thinking, before we go out with initial outreach, there's a lot of work to do between now and then. I don't think it was communicated that we would launch right into this, be catapulted into initial outreach. But I agree with you, there's more discussion that needs to be had between, town staff internally, but also communicated with the flood board, and agendize this in the future to really properly vet out the correct process.
Can I ask if there's a ballpark, target, any sort of target idea for when we might make this first approach to the residents? And it's totally fine if that's a premature question, if we don't even have that identified. I'm just curious.
I mean, if you're asking me to take a stab,
Any.
I would think within the next 6 months to a
Okay.
year, somewhere in that time frame.
So, so we've got plenty of time.
We have plenty of time, but obviously trying to get this on track sooner rather than later, knowing that the process could take 3 to 5 years, and knowing that projections for sea level rise, you could have a foot within 12 years. We don't want to arbitrarily delay it, but I think having the thoughtful discussions and really, really getting into this topic more in depth, is definitely warranted for future discussion.
Great, thank you.
Anything else?
No.
Engineering staff update.
Nothing to report.
Okay.
Just kidding.
Future agenda items.
No, I do have some updates for you.
Okay.
So with the Golden High Naptide Passage pump station improvements, I reviewed the plans, the 65% plans, and I got comments back to the consultant for them to work on. So they're moving forward with plans, and the next stop is going to receive 90% plans sometime early in April. So that's continuing to move forward. Also with the slotted drain at Harbor and Echo, I received 95% plans for those. Obviously, that was something that was shovel ready and pretty much ready to go. I had a couple comments just on the pipe alignments and trying trying to make the improvements favorable to future construction, meaning we don't want too many cross connections over our sewer. Obviously, if we ever had to go dig it up, we don't want to inadvertently hit storm drains. So the more we can take parallel paths with storm drain, that's better. So they're working on making some adjustments to the plans, but I'm expecting to go to council on the 20th for authorization to bid. Then probably sometime later this month, we'll go out for bid, and the timeline for opening bids is around late April for that project. And Keith, we actually, our Public Works Director, Peter, met with Caltrans on a separate matter, but, I informed him of what we had discussed as far as the flooding down on the off-ramp. And, as I understand, there was some discussion about that, and, there may be something programmed. But also, I went the next step, and I submitted a work request to District 4 for that area. So they're informed of the situation. So we'll keep on them.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else?
I think that's it for now for me.
Okay. Any questions?
No.
Questions? Well, good work. I thought this was a great presentation. I really appreciate Rachel being here to explain it in great detail, and glad that it's being worked on. We've got several really potential problems in relationship to the levees, as well as this ongoing issue at Ebb Tide and Golden Hind Passage. So I appreciate your work on that. Future agenda items?
Well, this is going to stay on there, I imagine, right? The tidal barrier.
Yeah, so I think breaking out the initial phase into an actual discussion item, I think we can definitely get a good solid discussion and get some solid feedback from having that on an agenda. Also, in the coming months, we're going to have to. I know we discussed the budget in some rights last time, and we came up with a preliminary list, but we'll probably have to get that back on and whittle down the list a little bit more based on available funding.
Okay. Meeting adjourned.